We spend our lives pretty much slave to our little ego mind. And remember that your ego is there for a purpose. It helps to kind of protect the integrity of this body system. And yet, ultimately, it's not who we are. We are much more than that, much grander. And that also opens the door to coming into wholeness and healing.
Hello, USU family, brothers and sisters. We are here today for a powerful conversation. I'm recording this right after I spoke with Dr. Eben Alexander, who is the author of the book that has changed my life. You've probably heard of it, Proof of Heaven. We will talk about his book, Living in a Mindful Universe. And I'm just going to say, if you are curious about NDEs, near-death experiences, about what happens after we transition, we die, is it real that we are connected at a deeper, higher spiritual realm? What happens, right? What happens to us mentally, physically, spiritually during that transition? And so much more around all things spirituality and metaphysics and quantum physics and understanding the incredible divinity that you are. Stay right here. You are in for a huge treat. You are going to love this conversation with Dr. Alexander, and I am so honored to bring him here to our community. And as always, thank you for being here. Thank you for putting in the time and the energy to connect and to uplift your own self, your own consciousness for the part that you're doing to bring more light to the planet. From my heart to yours, I love you, and I hope you enjoy. I am so excited and grateful for this conversation with you, Dr. Alexander. I read your book. For those watching, this is the first book, Proof of Heaven. We're going to talk about this book, and I know your third book, Living in a Mindful Universe. But I want to tell you, I was so riveted. It took my breath away. And I literally, in the middle of the night, I think I wrote an email and reached out and said, I have to interview you. We've got to talk about your experience. So I'm so honored. Thank you for being here today on the US2 podcast.
Well, Julie, thanks so much for having me on. It's great to meet you today, and I look forward to our conversation.
So I know that many listening and tuning in, some might know your story, but I'm going to assume for those who don't know your story, if we could just talk a little bit about, you are a trained, very highly efficient, ranked neurosurgeon. And then can you walk us through, I know you taught at Harvard, you had your life in the medical world, very left brain. We've had Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor on here before, who talks a lot about whole brain living and the left brain. So I always felt like when I was reading, you were very much in that scientific mind. And then something happened, big time, that
Right.
changed. Yeah.
Well, that's absolutely true. And to put it in a nutshell, important to point out who I was before. I grew up in a very scientific family. My father was a globally renowned neurosurgeon. I was adopted into that family. That's a critical part of the story,
Yeah.
that I was put up for adoption when I was 11 days old. And all that figures in very prominently to where this big story goes. But suffice it to say that back in early November of 2008, I was 54-year-old, had trained at Duke, spent 15 years teaching neurosurgery at Harvard Medical School, thought I had some idea of brain, mind, consciousness, and how it all works. In short, I basically was like so many of us, conventionally trained in materialism. I mean, that's the science of that period, that physicalism, the notion that only the physical world exists, and therefore the physical brain must somehow create consciousness purely out of physical matter. And that's what that whole scientific community believed. And the problem is that that defies the evidence. The evidence is very great that there's much more going on to mind, to this notion of spirit, interconnection, and all that. And that's what I was about to discover. Now, the means of getting there was this incredibly severe case of bacterial meningoencephalitis. So when I woke up early in the morning of November 10th, 2008, with severe back pain, thought if I got into a hot bathtub, maybe that would relieve it. I almost couldn't even get out of that tub. Baby steps back to the bed where I collapsed, writhing in agony. Soon thereafter, my youngest son, Bond, who was 10 years old at the time, came in the room and realized Dad looked horrible, wasn't off at work, what's going on? Started rubbing my head. And as soon as he touched my forehead, I felt like he'd driven a white hot spike right through the front of my head. I mean, just horrific pain, back pain, headache, etc. And then it was into grand mal seizures and coma right there at home. There's a myth out in the kind of lay press by an irresponsible, kind of malicious journalist that wanted to say this was all a medically induced coma. Now, even if it had been medically induced, to have the experience I had would be remarkable. But because the coma was actually due to severe meningitis that involved all lobes of my brain, it basically incapacitated all the human parts of the brain. So there would be no way to have such an experience given the objective medical data of my case. And that was all, that data was presented not just in the book Proof of Heaven, but it was greatly expanded upon by three scientists not involved in my care, but fascinated by my recovery, which most physicians who know anything about meningitis hear about this case, and they realize this recovery is very unusual. So that's really kind of the essence of the story is I had this extraordinary experience and then a recovery, that completely defies our medical literature on this kind of illness. I should have gone on to die. A week in coma from severe gram-negative bacterial meningitis doesn't leave you with an option of coming back to normal living. And yet I've had 15 and a half years of recovery, and within 2 months of waking up from coma, I was pretty much back to normal. And all my memories had returned. That was another thing. Of kind of an unusual feature of my NDE was amnesia. The fact that I had no memories of Eben Alexander's life, it really was an empty slate. I had no knowledge of Earth, of humans, this universe. Every bit of it was deleted. And I only realized in the months and years after my coma that complete deletion of memories was critical for me to fully accept the reality of the journey and not try and dismiss it as a hallucination or a dream or a trick of the dying brain. And so it's been an extraordinary journey of discovery. But in essence, I can kind of take you through the main elements, and then we can talk about any parts of it that you want to break down. Now, again, in this setting of pure amnesia, where I had no knowledge of Earth, humans, etc., I came to awareness in a place that I call the earthworm eye view. Very primitive, coarse, kind of unresponsive realm, like being in dirty jello. I have a strong memory of tactile sensations like roots, blood vessels all around me. I was a speck of awareness, but never at any point in the entire near-death experience did I have any kind of body awareness. So, and no memories at all of a human life and of humanity. So I was just witnessing all these things. And so the initial was down in this murky earthworm eye view. If I had just returned from that level, I would have had what's called a hellish or a negative near-death experience, which is about 3 to 5% of all the NDEs that occur. But no, I went further, and I would say that all the negative NDEs are just partial, like a life review where you've been greedy and selfish, and then you have to experience what that feels like from others around you. That's what a life review is all about, is kind of the experience from all perspectives. So anyway, in this particular journey, in that earthworm eye view, I didn't stay there forever. There was a slowly spinning white light that came associated with a perfect musical melody. And as that spinning light came towards me, it opened up like a rip in the fabric of that ugly earthworm eye view and led up into this brilliant, ultra real gateway valley. This is a mistake so many people make when they think about NDEs. They think, oh, they must be very murky and dreamlike and kind of ephemeral. And they're the opposite. They're sharp, real, detailed, powerful, meaningful, transformational. I mean, that's what NDEs are at their very nature. And so that's what I was beginning to witness here in this Gateway Valley. And the Gateway Valley was kind of a blending of many earth-like features and kind of material features with spiritual features. So, for example, I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing, and there were millions of other butterflies looping and spiraling in vast formations, incredible beauty. We were soaring above this lovely meadow surrounded by forest. I remember these sparkling waterfalls and the crystal blue pools. And all the plant life was very rich and lush and fertile. There was no sign of any death or decay. In many ways, that Gateway Valley is pretty much like Plato's world of ideals, but for the individual soul. It's kind of a template. That's why we would experience things like our life reviews there, our life flashing before our eyes in a realm like that Gateway Valley. Um, and the best part about it was all these things I'm witnessing, all this beauty. There were thousands of beings down in this meadow below us, dancing, joy and merriment, children playing, dogs jumping, incredible festivities, all being fueled because up above were these swooping orbs of angelic choirs, emanating chants and anthems, hymns that would just thunder through my awareness with this incredible sense of awe and bliss and love and connection. Um, and I remember in that very setting, uh, realizing there was this soft summer breeze that blew through. And later on in my writings, when I came back from all this and was trying to record it all, um, that soft summer breeze I labeled as the breath of God or the divine wind. It was really my first awareness in this completely amnesic state of that God force that completely permeated that realm with that sense of love, that sense of connection, that sense of a spiritual home. And that's what I was just beginning to bathe in, was this incredible sense of loving connection, meaning and purpose. I mean, it's just really an absolutely kind of indescribably beautiful sense of connection. And even though some of the words I use may sound foreign to people, I know there were thousands of people who reached out to me after they first read Proof of Heaven or heard me talk, which I began my talks on my experience 2 years before Proof of Heaven. Um, and they would uh, tell me they were awakened by something that my story, my recounting of the story, told them that reminded them of something deep in their own soul journey. So I got tremendous feedback from people early on that this was something that was kind of universal and shared and a spiritual home that we're all familiar with when we get there. Now, I'll move on through it. There's a lot more to the story, as people who've read Proof of Heaven will realize. But the best thing is kind of what happened next, because there was a beautiful young woman on this butterfly wing with me, sparkling blue eyes, high forehead, high cheekbones, broad smile. She never said a word. She never had to. Her message to me, delivered empathically, telepathically, intuitively, was this beautiful message that I think was the ultimate message for me to bring back to this world. You are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You are richly cared for. And especially in the setting of resolving my adoption abandonment wound, which I'd spent most of my life kind of not even realizing there was a smoking crater at the core of my being that remembered being left behind by my mother when I was 11 days old. And yet she wouldn't sign the paper. She didn't want to let me go. Social services had taken me because she was 16 years old and unwed. But she wouldn't sign the paper. So I got stuck in a baby dorm for 4 months. And all of that kind of abandonment wound that had been kind of a buried subconscious thing for most of my life was now coming to a very favorable and positive transformational resolution by my recognition of this oneness and love with the universe at large, and a sense of belonging and a sense of being here for a reason. Which is something that had kind of eluded me for much of my life. So anyway, what then happens is these angelic choirs that I saw in these swooping, swarms emanating these chants and anthems and hymns up above. Um, they provided yet another musical portal. And just like I'd come up from that earthworm eye view into the Gateway Valley through a kind of a spinning melody of light, likewise, now I saw all of four-dimensional space-time, the material realm, which I could sense, deeply below us from the spiritual realm, but then all of the spiritual realm, which includes this incredibly important notion of deep time or meta time. Because remember, when you hear people describe life reviews, which would occur in that part of it all, they describe them as being birth, death, everything in between simultaneously presented. It's not only that you've kind of slowed down time or altered your perception of time, but you've completely stepped outside of time. which is astonishing. That's what the spiritual realm is it's not bound by the rules of our temporal flow in this world. And so that notion of deep time and the spiritual realm having access to all points of your life and even past lives and future lives, very important to get this kind of bigger concept of time flow. But I saw all of it collapsing down. And that's when I ascended through yet another portal, a musical portal opened up by these angelic choirs, until I was left in the core. That was my final kind of, endpoint in this journey. And in the core, all dualities completely resolved. We live in a world where you've got masculine, feminine, dark, light, good, evil, etc., all these kind of spectra of possibilities. And yet in that realm, especially as I ascended to the core, all resolved into pure oneness. And that's where I came to recognize that my very conscious awareness was directly sourced in that infinitely creative and infinitely loving God force at the source of all that is in this universe. And to realize that we're never separate from that infinitely loving God force, right there in mind, when you realize how important mind is, consciousness, in this universe, that the whole universe exists within consciousness, not the other way around. And that's where this notion of free will is so important, because the materialist science that I had worshiped before my coma, and I do not use that term lightly, because in fact, modern scientific materialism is a faith-based religion where the evidence doesn't even support it. And this is where quantum physics is so important. And that's why our third book, Living in a Mindful Universe, is the real proof of heaven. That's where we really go the distance in uniting things like quantum physics and its demonstration of the primacy of mind, neuroscience, and the hard problem of consciousness, the binding problem, the apparent unity of consciousness in an individual, which is very hard to explain from materialist principles of multiple neuronal networks participating in the creation of this consciousness. Where does that unified sense of I am and I exist come from? It's because consciousness is unified from the get-go. And that's what I was just discovering as a neuroscientist, that our brain is not the creator of consciousness, but it's a reducing valve or filter that allows a little eddy current of that primordial unified mind, that God mind, to come into awareness. And we take that as ours. And yet you realize in scientific study that things like telepathy are very real. For example, Guillaume Playfair's book on twin telepathy, more than 35% of identical twins have such powerful telepathic connections that if one touches a hot stove, the other one develops a blister and pain, and the other twin can be 1,000 miles away. It doesn't matter. So this mental connection is very important to dissect out, and it's unified and it's connecting all of us with a sense of meaning and purpose, not just with our fellow beings, but with the universe at large. And that's what I was just beginning in this incredible journey, entering this core realm. And on entering the core, being told, not in words, but in pure conceptual flow, you're not here to stay. We'll teach you many things. You'll be going back. And it turns out would spontaneously drift back down to that earthworm eye view. And by remembering the musical notes of the melody, I could always conjure up the various light portals that would take me back up into that gateway valley. I was always welcomed there by that beautiful young woman on the butterfly wing, my spiritual guide. Many passes, a tremendous amount of information. I can't go into all of it, but we'll hit on some of it in your questions and in our conversation. But it turns out that there came a point where, as they told me on entering the core the first time, and I would cycle through these realms multiple times, a point where I realized that remembering the musical notes no longer conjured up that light portal. So I'm now stuck down in that earthworm eye view where it all began. But I knew I could trust in the universe, even though the memory of the musical notes no longer opened up these light portals to take me up into spiritual realms. I knew I could trust I would be taken care of. And that's when I saw thousands of beings going off around me into the distance, heads bowed, some holding candles, murmuring energy coming from them. And that murmuring energy, even though I didn't understand the words, it was very comforting. And it was kind of surprising to me because I was now in this earthworm eye view getting the same kind of beautiful comfort and reassurance that I'd first gotten in those higher levels in the Gateway Valley and in the core. But now I was getting it in this lowest level. And what I realized and what I labeled all that in my early writings is I said that was the power of prayer. And that's what was kind of ushering me back to this world. And it was then the last thing I saw in the NDE, six faces that would bubble up out of the muck. They'd say a few words and disappear. Now, I remember those faces as sharply and crisply today as if the whole thing happened yesterday morning. And yet it happened 15 and a half years ago. And the interesting thing about those faces is that this is just before I started to wake up in the ICU room. And when I did, it turns out that five of those faces were people physically present in the ICU the last 24 to 48 hours of coma. So they helped me to prove that the vast majority of the coma journey had to happen between days 1 and 4 or 1 and 5 of my 7-day coma journey. All the timing of that is explained in the book Proof of Heaven and in Living in a Mindful Universe. But importantly, it was the last of those faces that in many ways was the face that brought me back to this world. My amnesia was still very much in power. I still had been offered many lessons about the universe, but none of them directly referring to Eben Alexander's life. So shown many things, including these incredible visions in the core realm that prove the reality not only of the afterlife, but of reincarnation, the importance of the life review, your life flashing before your eyes, all of that. But now I was coming back to this world, and that sixth face was the one that got me back, and that was of a 10-year-old boy. Now, I didn't recognize him at the time, but that was day 7 of coma. And the doctors had just held a family conference where they said I'd gone from a 10% chance of survival early in the week down to 2% chance, but with no chance of recovery. And my son Bond, 10 years old at the time, had been protected from the worst news during that week, but he was outside that door and overheard that conversation. And that's when he knew it was much worse than he had been told. Comes running down the hallway, pulls open my eyelids that had been taped shut, so I'm lying there on my ventilator. And he's pleading with me, Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay. Now, I did not understand the words, but in spite of this entire journey, because of the amnesia and the lessons I was taught, I had come to believe this can all continue. It can cease. It doesn't matter. I had the amnesia kind of limited me from having any sense of connection to the various players in this drama. And yet now this sixth face got my attention because that pleading, even though I couldn't understand his words, it got through. And I promise you, I did not see him with my eyes. I didn't hear him with my ears. I was far too gone from this world. But it got through. And that's when I knew I somehow had to come back for him. And it was out of that sense of love for this other soul. And I didn't even know the nature of our connection. But that was what brought me back to this world. And I remember when I was waking up on the bed there, fighting the ventilator, they pulled out the breathing tube. To their shock, the doctors are realizing I'm coming back to this world. But initially, my brain was still very wrecked by the experience. I didn't even recognize my mother, my sisters, my sons at the bedside. I had no idea who these beings were. All I knew was where I had just been, that extraordinary spiritual journey that is still as sharp in my mind today as if the whole thing just happened. And yet again, we're now almost 16 years out from every bit of that. It took about 2 months for all my memories to come back. Shocking truth of that is that the memories were more complete and filled in after those 2 months than they had been before my coma. And that I recognized because of conversations with loved ones about ancient, childhood memories, etc. Both before and after the coma, I recognized that the memories were much clearer, cleaner, and more complete after the coma. It's almost like they got refreshed. That's something we talk about in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, is how modern neuroscience is coming to realize memories are not even stored in the brain. It's really one of the last giant nails in the coffin of materialist neuroscience, but so be it. I mean, science has to move closer to truth, and materialism fails miserably at explaining so much of human experience. There are better models in the scientific community. Idealism, something known as evolutionary panentheism, which is a notion of this kind of God force throughout all sentient beings' minds and throughout all of the universe. But we're really growing into that scientifically. But as we discuss in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, You have to consolidate a tremendous amount of information from multiple fields. So it's not just neuroscience and philosophy of mind, but all that evidence for non-local consciousness out of parapsychology, telepathy, remote viewing, past life memories in children, suggestion of reincarnation. I mean, these are all gigantic fields of scientific study that show us that the materialist model of brain creates consciousness is woefully inadequate and not even remotely capable of answering and explaining some of these human phenomena. So that's why I've worked with other scientists around the world for the last 15 years uh, in coming to these much richer, deeper, more powerful, and meaningful uh, worldviews that come closer to the truth. So that, in a nutshell, is kind of what I went through 15 and a half years ago that's changed my life dramatically.
Wow. Evan, thank you so much for that was beautifully summed up. I mean it's just incredible. I have a lot of questions. So I think one of the things I want to point out that I just find so fascinating, and I'm curious if this, how this relates for you, coming up through, I know your father was a physician, I believe.
Yes.
You studied, at Duke, you're teaching at Harvard, you're a renowned neurosurgeon, you're in this world. I know you talked about in the book of having patients that had experienced NDEs and not believing them or really thinking,
Right.
that's nice, you're just out of it.
Mhm. I thought it was a hallucination, a trick of the dying brain. I was
Right. So
wrong.
you were wrong. And I think what's so amazing to me is such a esteemed, practicing neurosurgeon to talk about portals and telepathy and remote viewing and to start, you know, taking the woo out of these things that people find, especially I would imagine in the scientific community. I mean, I think you did talk about it in the book. There were some friends and people that you worked with that I don't know if they still think that you're on the different train, but probably thought, what are you talking about? This is impossible. I mean, you talked about how they couldn't get their head around it. And I'm curious, what have you noticed in the scientific community around your findings?
Well, it's interesting. People often think this is science versus religion or science versus spirituality. And yet, some of my greatest support has come from the scientific community.
Yeah.
Because scientists, true scientists, realize that our scientific materialism is false. It's a lie.
Yeah.
And to pretend that we exist birth to death and nothing more, that the brain creates consciousness, is a lie. That's not true. I mean, when you study, for example, University of Virginia, they've studied in the last 6 decades more than 2,500 cases of past life memories in children suggestive of reincarnation. And of those 2,500 cases, 1,700 are solved. That is, yep, they found the person who lived before. So when you start reviewing that scientific literature, and any of your viewers can go to uvadops.org. That's the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies, and a lot of their papers, books, etc., are right there. This is all by a rigorous scientific academic institution of scholars who have studied these cases rigorously over 6 decades. And you find that there's a tremendous amount of truth to it. And it's not people fooling themselves or other people fooling people, etc. These are real cases and real stories. And that have been vetted and validated in a very rigorous fashion to eliminate fraud and people being misled. That's just one starting point. There are two other websites I could give you, GalileoCommission.org and scientificandmedical.net. Both of those websites will lead you towards us. I'm on the scientific advisory group for both groups. They're European. And it turns out that they are way along the pathway of showing the reality of these expanded worldviews that leave, the bleak and paltry fiction of materialism, pretending that when the brain dies, our consciousness ends. They
Yeah.
leave that in the rearview mirror because that is not true.
Mm.
That's not the way it works. And in fact, there's a beautiful resource that all of your folks can go to, bigelowinstitute.org. And what you'll find there was a contest by Robert Bigelow in 2021. He had lost his wife. His son had committed suicide. He wanted to know, is there any truth to this this notion that their souls are still there, that they're still available to me. And so we put a question out to the scientific audience and said, what's the best scientific evidence for continuation of conscious awareness after permanent bodily death? And to that, when they also stipulated you had to show at least 5 years of scientific research experience studying the afterlife. Well, in that setting, they got 204 essays. And in that setting, he was originally going to give out 3 monetary awards, but instead the essays were so good, he gave out 29 monetary awards. And all 29 of those essays are available for free right now to the reading public, bigelowinstitute.org. Go there and start with Jeffrey Mishlov's first place essay. You'll quickly realize that the scientific proof of the reality of the afterlife and reincarnation is already well established. And then they've got plenty of other essays there. Some are deeply scientific, like Dean Radin's essay, like Bernardo Kastrup's essay, Julie Beichel's essay, Pim Van Lommel's essay. I mean, I don't want to exclude anybody because there are 29 incredibly powerful essays. But you'll realize that anybody who tells you, I'm a scientist and afterlife is nonsense, it's all hallucination, all they're telling you is they're willfully ignorant, that they're either too lazy or just absolutely unaware of the Bigelow Institute essays. But we've gone past the point where anybody can say that this is not scientifically valid, the reality of the afterlife. And it absorbs scientific fields very richly, like quantum physics, which has been screaming at us for more than 100 years, that consciousness is united and fundamental and not derivative from the brain itself. And neuroscience, philosophy of mind, parapsychology, all the evidence for non-local consciousness, all that evidence I talked about with the reincarnation stories, etc. To explain mind, brain, and the nature of reality, we need a much bigger theater of operations than that puny little tent of nonsense of materialist science. So it's high time this world move beyond it. This is deeply scientific. That's the thing. It's not woo-woo nonsense at all. This is how you come to answers about the measurement paradox in quantum physics, which has puzzled the scientific community for more than 100 years. They have no idea how to make sense of it until now, when we're finally entertaining the notion of brain as a filter and consciousness as primordial, when all of it starts to make more sense.
I'm pausing really quickly. I want to share something very exciting. There are some changes coming to the USG podcast. We are going to be adding a Divine by Design segment where we are going to be collecting your sacred stories, your signs, your synchronicities. These are the kinds of experiences that give goosebumps, that when you hear them, your mind is blown. So if you would like to submit one of your sacred stories, go to juliereisler.com/share. There you'll find a form. You can fill it out, upload your 2 to 3 minute video. We will be watching and going through all of the submissions and hope to share your sacred story and shine your light on this community, because in truth, we are all divine by design and we rise together in community. We are about uplifting consciousness and sharing these beautiful, powerful synchronicities and sacred signs and stories. This is what helps to build our faith muscle. So I hope to get a submission from you, my friend. And as always, thank you so much for being part of this beautiful community. I so appreciate you sharing all of these resources, this community and audience global around the world. We're here because we're thirsty. We're hungry for deeper knowledge, to understand. And, to me, listening to you, just to think of the perfection of someone who's such an esteemed neurosurgeon to go through this and be able to come out the other side, the miracle of it. And also for you then, with your rigorous research experience and a scientific mind, to be able to now teach and share what you're learning from a scientific approach. It's actually quite exquisite. Obviously, I'm so sorry you had to go through excruciating pain, but
I have no
wow.
regrets.
Yeah.
It's all worth it.
I do want to, before we get into your third book, Living in a Mindful Universe, and talking about how some of these things work and breaking that down, I do want to ask you a couple of, they might sound silly questions, but I sometimes hear what other people are asking and then I'm curious. So when you saw the butterfly, the beautiful woman on the butterfly, you talked about having this really deep connection with her. Can you share a little bit about what you discovered?
Well, yeah, it turns out she was my spiritual guide. I mean, she was there multiple times. Every time I'd come up from that earthworm eye view and then into this brilliant ultra real gateway valley, it was always with her there. This loving look, this incredible message, telepathic message of connection and reassurance and of sharing our spiritual home. I mean, it was amazing. And so then, fast forward to the end of the journey, I'd never read the NDE literature before. I always thought, dying brain playing tricks, who cares? Well, now I wanted to read every bit of it. But my older son, who was with me there 2 days after I got out of the hospital, Eben the fourth, and he was majoring in neuroscience in college at the time. So he was in perfect position to advise me about that. And I remember he drove home. It was day before Thanksgiving, 2008, gave me a big hug. It was 6 o'clock in the morning because he drove overnight to get there because he'd heard I was so energized by this experience, I couldn't sleep. I'd be up all night sitting by the fire, writing, reading, trying to understand things. But he got there and he told me, make sure you write everything down about your experience before you read anybody's near death experience. And that's not what I wanted to hear. I wanted to read all these other cases and try and understand mine. But he was exactly right. I didn't want to taint my database, with other people's experiences. And I'd never paid attention to that literature, so there was nothing there to taint. But after I finished writing about 20,000 words of encapsulating my experience, it took several weeks to do all that, but that's when I dove into that NDE literature. And the thing that shocked me was I found that there's often this guardian angel, this spiritual guide, just like I had. But always in these cases, that guide is reported to someone very important in someone's life. And we'd had this mind meld, so I knew her in many ways very deeply and closely and personally, and yet I knew I'd never met her in my life. That was a big mystery. And that took a while to get to some answers about. But the reality is people who've read the book Proof of Heaven will realize, about 4 months after my coma, after I'd done a lot of this reading and trying to make sense of it, that's when I received a picture in the mail. And that picture was related to the fact that I'd finally met my birth family a year before my coma. And believe me, the adoption abandonment wound is a gigantic part of this story. But in many ways, all of us have that kind of an abandonment wound because we come in from the spiritual realm and then we go through program forgetting. Most people will claim, I don't remember past lives. That can't be so. Well, what Dr. Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker, who studied all those cases at UVA, will tell you is you need to harvest those memories before age 5 or 6 because natural processes cover them over. So that by the time we're teenagers, most of us don't have natural, ready access to past life and between life memories. But they can be recovered through having a near-death experience, through hypnotic regression, through meditation, sometimes just spontaneously. But those memories can be recovered. And then you start realizing you're much more than just a body living this life, but you're a soul that's been here before and will be here again. And the other thing about all this is the modern science on this study of consciousness is showing us that consciousness is unified. We are sharing one mind. And in fact, Pim van Lommel's essay, he won second place in that Bigelow competition. He's a renowned and very respected Dutch cardiologist who wrote a landmark paper in the esteemed journal Lancet back in 2001 on more than 300 cases of cardiac arrest, where he found about a 20%, 18 to 20% incidence of spiritual experiences, near-death experiences. At the end of Pim van Lommel's essay, he starts making the case for the one mind. And that is the case we make in Living in a Mindful Universe. And in fact, Dr. van Lommel makes reference as to 4 scientific resources that he says support this one mind hypothesis. One is the book by Larry Dossey entitled One Mind, which I love. Excuse me. The book Spiritual Science by Steve Taylor. Then an essay by Bernardo Kastrup, The Universe in Consciousness, that was in Journal of Consciousness Studies. back in 2018. Excuse me. And then finally, our book, Living in a Mindful Universe. But I would also recommend supporting Pim Van Lommel's One Mind arguments there to look at Pim's book, which is called Consciousness Beyond Life. So all of these resources start to point out how we're really dealing with one mind. We fool ourselves into thinking we're separate, but in fact, the evidence is there and becomes crystal clear during an NDE, this overlap of minds, because you start overlapping with minds of people who've left the physical plane, overlapping with minds of people still embodied, but at a distance. They can be thousands of miles away. That's the origin of what are called shared death experiences, just like near death, but they involve bystander souls, loved ones, sometimes healthcare workers, but those souls get taken along on the journey, witness the very same things that near-death experiencers describe, but then the bystander soul comes back to this world.
So beautiful. It's so powerful. I actually, just to share for the first time, I did a past life regression this past weekend. I actually noticed the timing of our interview with a QHTT practitioner with Dolores Cannon's work, and I'll be honest, I'm still taking in what came up for me. It was very profound. And I've never tried any. I've personally not used any kind of like DMT or ayahuasca or anything. Although for friends who have said it was, the way I described it sounds similar, but it was 3.5 hours. I felt like I was to the right of my body, and it was like this higher wisdom. But when it was this one main life I was regressing, I sound different. My face looked, I mean, it was still, I'm still processing. I've said to the divine, let me do it that way. I prefer not to have an NDE. I'd prefer to do the regression. But, I can just tell you as someone who, in my 40s, I'm not 5 or 6, obviously, but it was so powerful, and I'm still processing. And so what you're saying, it's resonating at a very deep core cell level for me. And I'm sure others watching who've had these experiences too.
Well, it's a beautiful awakening
Yeah.
to this kind of grander aspect of self.
Yeah.
We spend our lives pretty much slave to our little ego mind. And remember that your ego is there for a purpose. It helps to kind of protect the integrity of this body system. And yet, ultimately, it's not who we are. We are much more than that, much grander. And that also opens the door to coming into wholeness and healing. Because so many of the illnesses and infirmities that we face in these lifetimes are there as part of kind of providing the material from which we grow. Hardships, challenges, difficulties are actually gifts. They allow us to grow into the higher soul we came here to be. But if we kind of suffer early on, to the whims of the ego and get stuck in this ego toxicity, I mean, that's what, for example, addictions are all about, is ego toxicity and the unreasonable demands of the ego. And when we rise above that, which is something I do all the time in meditation, I use sacred acoustics, a very powerful tool, differential frequency brainwave entrainment. And full disclosure is Sacred Acoustics is a company that was co-founded by my partner, my wife, and the co-author of the book Living in a Mindful Universe. But I found it 11, 12 years ago that these binaural beats were an incredibly powerful tool for deep meditation. It's because they influence the lower brainstem. And that is where the action is. We talk about what's going on with binaural beats and why they're so powerful in the book Living in a Mindful Universe. That having these beats causing an oscillation in the lower brainstem it acts like hypnosis. Hypnosis, you often use a pendulum. That's eye movement slowly back and forth. EMDR, similar principle. That's eye movement desensitization reprocessing, which is used as a very effective treatment against post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. But it turns out that these oscillations in the lower brainstem can be very powerful. And when you're using something like Sacred Acoustics, and people can learn more at sacredacoustics.com, but you find that this oscillation way down in the lower brainstem at an even deeper level than those eye movement issues with the pendulum and with EMDR creates a very powerful brew in which conscious awareness can be liberated from the here and now and sense of self. And so for me, meditation is a far more effective, powerful way of kind of getting into this territory, spiritual growth, exploring who we are as spiritual beings. And I do not recommend the psychedelic route. I'm very glad as a scientist that we're now studying psychedelics because, in fact, they show us beautiful and important things in this discussion. One quick example, and this is something we discuss in great detail in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, is that anybody who's ever taken psilocybin, DMT, LSD, what have you, probably thinks their brain is lighting up like a Christmas tree to explain all the incredible phenomenal experience they're having. Well, that's not what's going on. If you use functional MRI, magnetoencephalography, the techniques we have to really dig down deep into looking at the nerve cells and their networks and their interactions, you'll find that no nerve cell in the entire brain is increasing activity under these substances. They're all going quiet. They're going dark. The default mode network, which is a very well-described network that supposedly aligns with kind of our daydreaming ego self, that whole default mode network dissolves. It disappears under the influence of these substances. So you cannot, as a neuroscientist, pretend that using these deep tools for examining every neuron in the brain is going to help you explain the neural correlates of what's causing these experiences, because all the brain is doing is getting out of the way. It is retreating to allow you to have the experience. So you need much more than our materialist neuroscientific tools to come to deeper answers about all this. We need to look at the overall experience. So that's one important thing. And multiple papers have come out showing not just psilocybin, but DMT, LSD, etc. All of them turn off the brain. They help it to get out of the way. That's why you get these extraordinary spiritual experiences. And the one other quick point I would make about the psychedelics, Roland Griffiths, who sadly passed from this world last October, but he was at Johns Hopkins, and he was instrumental as a scientist at reopening these scientific investigations into these plant medicines or entheogens like DMT, psilocybin, LSD, etc. And his studies showed powerful results in fighting addiction, the worst addictions we know, opioids, nicotine, alcohol, and an alcoholic, etc. And he found basically one dose of psilocybin. A year later, 80% success rate at alleviating those addictions, and another study population, terminal cancer patients who had a debilitating fear of death, one dose of psilocybin in a proper therapeutic setting. They don't need constant dosing. Okay, so microdosing like they do out in Silicon Valley is not the route. One dose is a meaningful dose is enough to open you up to kind of the reality of your higher soul, and that's where healing and wholeness comes into play. That's why NDEs can be so healing. They give you a gigantic industrial strength exposure to this higher soul, this one mind, this kind of best aspect of self, the opposite of the ego and its little petty games. This is who we all truly are. And it's growing into that higher soul, exploring it more deeply through meditation, centering prayer, and then living these lives. And if you meditate every day, sooner or later, your mind starts to shift dramatically in a very positive direction. And that's exactly what all of this is about, becoming more of the souls we came here to be.
Yeah. That is actually, when I created the show, Being Your Youest You, you've just summed up what I was trying to say in that, in that kind of fun language, that this aspect of ourselves, we get trapped in thinking the little egoic, the small self is who we are. And this is what I love about what you're sharing, Dr. Alexander, is we are, we're getting the 1%, that little small self, and there's like 99% of just incredible connection, oneness, love, the one mind. I had a question about the sacred acoustics and the music. I have found solfeggio and hemisync and other kinds of tunes, but you mentioned in your NDE that you heard this beautiful angelic choir, and I was so curious when you were talking. Have you ever been able to emulate what you heard, or have you heard anything that sounds like that? Do we even have sound here that's like that? And if so, where do we get that? Is that Sacred
Well,
Acoustics?
we
Because,
do. We
okay.
do, but we don't. It's not in a form that you could ever deliver through the ears. The
Ah,
ears are very limited to, sounds from 20 hertz, 20 cycles per second, up to 20,000 cycles per second. And that varies with age and many other things. But no, this is all about using that binaural beat. Uh, that's a slightly different frequency to the two ears. That's where the power comes in. And the way it then lets you share the kind of music I heard is by letting you dive deep into those spiritual realms where you can
mm,
hear the very same kind of idealized form of music on your own. Now, it turns out, in our modern world, there's a tremendous amount of anxiety, angst about our political situation, etc. Well, at the very beginning of the pandemic, there was a paper published in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases that specifically reports on the power of sacred acoustics, binaural beat brainwave entrainment to alleviate anxiety. That study was by Dr. Anna Yusim, Y-U-S-I-M. She's a very renowned spiritual psychiatrist, works mainly out of New York City, but Yale trained and now out of Connecticut. We presented with her. In fact, we did a mental health practitioner course with Dr. Yusim that's available at innersanctumcenter.com for people who are interested in learning much more from a therapeutic standpoint. Go to innersanctumcenter.com. But anyway, with Dr. Yusim in her study, she found a 26% reduction in anxiety over 2 weeks of listening to sacred acoustics tones. That's versus an only 7% improvement in those symptoms in the patients who got standard talk therapy for anxiety. And the set of files that were used for that study is called the Whole Mind Bundle. And that study was published in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease in February of 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic. Karen realized pandemic was going to be a giant source of anxiety for the world. So she very graciously reduced the price of the Whole Mind Bundle. And in fact, knowing that many people in the pandemic were in economic hardship and wouldn't have any money to spare for anything, she had a free option at sacredacoustics.com where you could select the Whole Mind Bundle and hit free. And we hope that people who have the resources will pay for it. But that free option is still available thanks to the generosity of Karen Newell and of Sacred Acoustics to give this very powerful and proven technology to the world at large. So I think it's important for people to acknowledge that, start using it. You can basically get the stuff for free. There's a 20-minute file that's also available for free at sacredacoustics.com. And I would encourage people to look through her website because there are a lot of pointers, information about how to put this to great effect, how best to meditate, how to turn off that little monkey mind voice in our head. I love how Michael Singer, in his book, The Untethered Soul, he calls that voice in your head your annoying roommate, because that is what that voice is. It's nothing more than that. It's your little ego mind. That is not who you are. You are far grander than that. And that's where meditation, centering prayer, and then starting to live the lessons of a life revealed through these kind of techniques of connecting with the spiritual realm. That's where we really grow into the souls we came here to be.
oh, so beautiful. I am loving, and we will, all of this information, I want to say for everyone in the show notes in YouTube in the description, I'll make sure to put all of this information so that people can easily click on it and find it with Sacred Acoustics, with all of what you're mentioning. I had one other question about your NDE, and then I do want to ask a little more about your third book. You mentioned beings. You mentioned, in this conscious awareness as you're flying on the wing of the butterfly and you're looking down and you're seeing these jubilant, happy beings. Are these beings, do you recognize, do they look like humans? Do they have a different, I'm just inquiring minds want to know.
Well, I basically interpreted what I saw there as souls between lives. I mean, these were humans. And as I said, I had very specific recollection of children playing and of dogs jumping.
Yeah.
So this is a realm that's not just, human mind. It's not a human invention. The spiritual realm is absolutely loaded with kind of animal presence. And in fact, this is where that whole paper by Bernardo Castrop, The Universe in Consciousness, starts to make so much more sense. And how we make sense of this concept of idealism, of the primacy of mind. But we start to note that we're all interconnected. And we're all here to share in this kind of growth and transformation. It's the evolution of consciousness itself. That's what we're all contributing to. That's what this is really all about. And so it was, I did have visions, as I discuss in Proof of Heaven, of far grander civilizations. So they participate too in this. I mean, civilizations that are as far advanced beyond us as we are beyond earthworms. So I saw a tremendous kind of theater of operations of this universe in kind of allowing for the evolution and growth and transformation of it's basically the mind of the universe learning about itself as it grows and matures. And I would say that quantum indeterminacy from quantum physics is right at the heart of human free will. Well, the reality of kind of mind over matter, free will, I mean, all of that. And also important to point out that there are major indicators of kind of that you can know the future. Precognition is something that's been shown, at least for seconds to minutes in advance. Precognition is, and that's something, again, we discuss in full detail in Living in a Mindful Universe. But precognition brings up the whole notion of predestination, like how much of this is pre-planned. But I would say that in many ways, the hardships and challenges are pre-planned. And it's how we deal with them, how we accept and kind of grow into those challenges in life, the hurdles. That's what allows for the growth of the soul. So that's where we really start to see how free will and some form of kind of predetermination of the various challenges is part of the reality we face as spiritual beings living in a spiritual universe. So it's really kind of working with a much grander idea of those kind of things. And in that same discussion, I will point out if you go to ebenalexander.com, and there's a recommended reading list, and there are a tremendous number of resources there for people who want to learn more about all this. But three of those are books on what's called retrocausality in quantum physics, which shows how the future can impact the past and the present. And it might sound kind of mysterious, but this is we're headed to a deeper understanding, but that deeper understanding largely supports the reality of free will and of human soul. And that's where I think probably if we write another book, it would have to do with the scientific proof of the reality of our concept of soul. And our souls are all interconnected. There's no such thing as an individual soul. Our souls are working together in this process of refinement, advancement, and transformation of all of consciousness itself.
So much information, so many resources. I'm so glad you have this book list. I'm going to be going. I'm sure some of them, but I can't get enough of this. I think at a deep level, Eben, we are all, those I'm sure here are just so hungry. We want this information so badly. I know for me and listening to you, and this is one of the biggest gifts about your experience and who you are and what you're teaching and sharing. At a deep level, I always tune into my intuition, my body, and it's alignment. It feels so aligned with what you're saying. There's so much more than what we understand. Even you saying, free will and this predetermination, how it almost feels like being able to embrace a paradox, the both and, that
Right.
there can be, we don't live in I'm ironically wearing black and white, so funny. We don't live in a black and white, which is
I'm wearing
hilarious.
blue.
Yeah, you're in the middle, right? Exactly. There you go. And that in itself is asking us to expand, to come from a place. We live in a world of polarity here, and for most people, that's what we think and know. But I love what you said, that our challenges, I wrote this down, our challenges are actually often predetermined, and the biggest growth opportunity, the biggest, I was thinking about it. I've had this thyroid condition, it's healing, but honestly, it's not been very fun. And I was just thinking, well, you know what, if that was predetermined, I mean, it did kind of change my life in a really amazing way. I'm probably doing this work in part because it heals me to speak and to speak truth. So it feels different when we look at it that way. Anyhow, I'm having a moment of that's brilliant. Thank you.
Well, it's important to embrace those hardships and challenges because,
Yeah.
many times our little ego will say, "Why me? Why me?" Well, me because I am in the process of growing into the soul I came here to be, and this is
Yeah.
where it's by opening our minds to these much greater possibilities that we can grow into that.
Yeah.
And you can befriend the ego, but in meditation, I let my ego state a request, ask a question, what have you, but then that ego voice goes into timeout. And that's why I've learned to ride those tones of sacred acoustics and go very deep into that hypnagogic space between awake and asleep, into kind of a lucid dream state
Yeah.
where the universe can show me many things in response to that initial request in a meditation. And I promise you that if you spend plenty of time exploring consciousness through meditation and centering prayer, you'll discover that you are a far grander being than you think at the moment when you're kind of thinking of this material body and your
Yeah.
existence since birth, living this life. Well, you're much more than that, and that's where we can all contribute to the evolution of consciousness itself.
Hey, my friend, I just wanted to pop in really quickly and let you know that I have now opened the doors to my newest spiritual membership, The Sanctuary. If you're looking to truly learn how to follow the signs, connect to your spirit guides, harness and trust your intuition, become more magnetic so you can attract your partner, your soul fit clients, whatever your heart desires, come check out The Sanctuary. Go to juliereisler.com/sanctuary. And I wanted to share, I have a very special gift and coupon for you, my YouTube family. Make sure you use the code Sanctuary YouTube. That will give you the first month for free so you can try it. You can cancel it anytime. And I would love to meet you and connect with you. And yes, I will be leading intuitive guided messages every single month live and giving personal messages. This will be such a high vibe, amazing community and opportunity to truly access your intuition and your USU. Okay, back to the show. Love you. Amen to that. I'm going to go meditate after our conversation again and find these sacred acoustic beats. You know, second to, I have two last questions before we
Uh-huh.
wrap. I wanted to know, do you feel like your ability to your psychic or intuitive abilities, have those shifted in any way since your NDE?
Well, I would say they expanded. My sense of intuition, of empathy with others expanded tremendously,
Mm,
especially as I came to recognize that false sense of separation
yeah.
that materialism teaches us is false. It's not true. And we are much more connected, and we're here to help each other, to help the least, the last, and the lost. So
Mm,
in the current era, we are here to take in the immigrants, help people, help all of our fellow beings. That is what gives us that true
yeah.
growth as soul beings, as spiritual beings, living together in this beautiful spiritual universe of transformation and evolution. As we're here to show unconditional love, kindness, compassion, mercy, when necessary, forgiveness, and never forget gratitude. But these are really the major tools of enhancing our sense of identification with this grander soul, interconnected with all other souls in meaning, purpose, and in kind of mental connection. And the more we live that, the more we can come into wholeness and healing.
Beautiful. Is there any last, I usually on this show call them heart flares, or just I didn't ask you a question or something that's there for you that you would like to end with or share about that for our community?
Basically, no soul left behind. This
Mm,
tremendous awakening and revolution in human thought is here to liberate each and every one of us from the shackles of those limited beliefs that, when our body dies and our brain dies, that's the end of our conscious awareness, end of our soul. That is false. We are much grander than that. And this is really a gift of love to all fellow beings. So, given its scientific validity, the science is what means, we've had 5,000 years plus for religions to teach us the golden rule, treat others as you would like to be treated. But now it's science, the science that supports the reality of NDEs, the science that supports the reality of this kind of evolutionary panentheism worldview, far grander than materialism. that allows us to come into the being the souls we came here to be. So it's really all about growth and transformation and about bringing harmony and peace to this world at large.
Beautifully said. No soul left behind. Oh, so beautiful. I could literally listen and talk to you all day. Perhaps you will come back again if open to it, because there's so many more questions, but I want to say thank you so
Well,
much, Dr. Alexander, for the work you're doing. This is going to help so many of our beautiful brothers and sisters that are listening, so many resources. And I thank you and your soul for the journey you've been on, for the experience you had in your NDE and as a physician before and after, and the work you're doing. It's heart aligned, and it is so needed in this world. And I just thank you, thank you, thank you.
thank you, Julie. My pleasure. And thank you for doing what you do to get all this out to the world. Blessings to you.
Thank you. And we're just going to send some love to you, brothers and sisters, our USU family. Thank you. And we'll have all of the resources listed because there were so many. I have notes. And thank you for being on this journey of evolving your consciousness. With love always.